Okay, so I have 1 o'clock on my screen right now, and I'd like to get into the next item on our agenda for this August council meeting. I, I thought some of you might appreciate the fact that over the last 2 weeks with ASMFC and the Mid-Atlantic Council, I have been stuffed down into the basement of my home, which now the kids and my wife have decided that that's where I need to stay. They no longer want to have me operating out of my makeshift office in the kitchen because they don't want to hear about fish anymore. So that was a discussion over lunch today, and I thought some of you would appreciate that. But with that said, we have our next item on this agenda is to talk about Atlantic mackerel. There are a number of things we need to consider, and there was a recent committee meeting along with the AP. So we're going to see some motions that are going to come out of that came from that meeting. I'm going to go next to Jason Didden with council staff for the presentation, and we'll just take one thing at a time as we go. Jason, it's all you if you're ready to go.
Thank you. So for agenda for today, going to do a quick review of current management, touch on the AP's fishery performance report, do a quick assessment review. Then for the committee, I summarize the SSC findings, but we have Dr. Rago today will do that. It's a bit of overlap between those, my assessment review and Dr. Rago's, but I think it's helpful overlap. And then get on to potential action. And again, we have committee motions related to those. Few quick acronyms. I think it's useful, just these will pop up frequently. SSB, spawning stock biomass. The MTA is a management track assessment. MSY, maximum sustainable yield. F, fishing mortality, the mortality that fishing creates. SSC, scientific and statistical committee. ABC, acceptable biological catch. DAH is domestic annual harvest, is really the quota in the mackerel fishery. Then GARFO, the Greater Atlantic Regional Fisheries Office, the National Marine Fisheries folks that help us out. So, and this is a little different order than we went through with the committee, but given Paul's summary, I think the different order makes sense. So quick management review where we are. A rebuilding plan was implemented for mackerel in late 2019. The original projections indicated we'd rebuild on that plan by 2023. That now appears very unlikely. So it's kind of a funny situation. We really have minimal overlap with the rebuilding plan and the data in the new management track assessment, but that assessment suggests that some changes are warranted given stock status and overfishing. The realized catches that we've seen in recent years have been below even the most aggressive rebuilding plan that was considered by the council. So kind of regardless of which, we had the P-STAR, the 5-year, the 7-year, whatever the kind of council would have picked at that point, we basically would have been in the same place right now. So where are we right now? These are the current mackerel specifications. See that commercial quota at the bottom, a little over 17,000 metric tons. The recreational allocation here deduction, that 1,270 metric tons, that's in the old MRIP numbers. You'll see kind of that's revised in terms of the paper deductions, but since that was old MRIP numbers, it's actually fairly equivalent to the new higher number. I think you all have, and we've gone through some of the MRIP changes quite a bit in previous meetings. Here, you'll see we were deducting 10,000 for Canada at this time. The council made that decision. That's kind of what the best guess of that was. Canada sets their quota mid-year for that year, so it makes it a little tricky to figure that out. We haven't gotten into situations, I think, where we've been substantially underestimating their catch, but since they've been reducing their quota and we've been kind of using their quota recently, that's why it's a bit higher than the current quota for Canada of about 4,000 metric tons. So in terms of in season, at 90%, for the directed permits, they go down to a 40,000 pound trip limit. There's some tiers of permits there. Some of them have some other trip limits, but once you hit 90%, they go to 40,000 pounds, and then incidental open access goes from 20,000 to 5,000. And that kind of stepping feature was really designed to reserve some quota for still substantial incidental catch and try to avoid regulatory discards. And at 98% of the DH, all permits have a 5,000 pound trip limit. So this is kind of where we are right now this year. Just the quota update last week. So about 30% of the quota. The blue line is this year. The yellow-orange line is last year. And as you can see, we're tracking below last year. And you can see those 90% and 98% quota thresholds up at the top. So a few highlights from the fishery performance report. Kind of ongoing concern. There's some kind of thermal regime shifting going on for pelagics in general. Concerns about COVID data gaps, whether it's missed observer coverage or survey gaps, flagging that COVID has really especially impacted the fresh market. The frozen export market has been more stable. However, that market has been impacted by trade issues, tariffs, and increasing container costs. Folks flagged the low herring quota and lack of herring RSA, and New England's 12-mile midwater trawl ban line creates reduced opportunities, especially in the fall in northern areas for mackerel. And some mixed input on rebuilding approaches from the AP. Again, this is maybe about a month ago, and kind of some perspectives saying, hey, it looks like this is a recruitment event. Why, before you punish the fishery too hard, is our further reductions really going to matter that much? Versus other perspectives saying, look at where we are, the truncated age structure, the ecosystem approach to fisheries management guidance document suggests maybe more caution with mackerels listed as a forage stock in that document. So kind of some mixed input on kind of what the council should think about in terms of rebuilding from the AP. And then finally, some concern over lack of ability to control rec catch. Most of the catch has been occurring in state waters. We'll touch on this a bit later. One other kind of thing I'll flag, that kind of prepping for that AP fishery performance report, staff puts together some kind of background catch information that we're generally covering in other segments of the meeting today, but did flag the inflation adjusted prices are relatively high for mackerel kind of compared to the time series. So it seems like if mackerel are out there, that price is relative, obviously not the highest in the time series, but relatively high. So again, Paul will touch on some of the SSC's perspective on the assessment, so a bit of overlap here, but a few kind of key points from staff's perspective. So the benchmark ended with data in 2016, the management track assessment 2019, so we got 3 new years of data. But we're kind of starting behind where we thought we were with that previous assessment. The SSB in 2016 from the management track now is revised down by about 29% compared to where we thought we were with the last assessment. So we're kind of starting further behind, even in 2016. Still about double overfishing in 2019. The trends have been down for overfishing, but still about double in 2019. There have been some increases in SSB from over the most recent years in the assessment, about 39% from 2016 to 2019, but that's only 24% of the new target which was revised lower because of some more low recruitment, some changes in some of the biological information. And then when you look at from 2014, which is the estimate for the time series now minimum, 2019, still about almost a tripling of biomass from that low point, but still only at 24% of the target. So this is a catch time series. It's always useful to review. We had this, the large foreign fishery in the 70s, some JV in the 80s, the US and Canada ramping up in the 2000s before a reduction in the most recent years for catch. And SSB is kind of follows along with those more or less. It was very high in the beginning, some peaks there as some recruitment events pushed through that the fisheries caught. And so these figures, I've amended them slightly from what's in the assessment. The assessment figures kind of have, from my perspective, a slightly funny look to them because there's not a horizontal line at 0 in them. So it kind of makes it hard to tell where 0 is in them. So I've added an extra line here at 0 for these next few figures, just so folks can kind of see where we are related to 0 for them. So this is trends in SSB. Again, that low point in the 20 teens, and then coming up a bit since then, but still substantially below the target. And one of the first things I think will jump out as a question maybe is that, why is the target even a little bit lower than 200,000 metric tons, so much lower than where we thought the biomass was? And that has partially to do with recruitment. We'll touch on that a bit later. These are trends in F. F really peaking at quite high around 2010. Again, we had catches going up, biomass pretty low there. And then in the most recent years, catches have been going down, biomass has been creeping up a bit, so that F, while still overfishing, has been decreasing in most recent years. Okay, so here's recruit estimates. And so those initial very high recruitments, they're kind of not included when the assessment tries to predict the reference points where we should go to. There was a decision made in the benchmark assessment, what's now referred to as a research track assessment, that we don't seem to be in a situation where those are really likely. So they were excluded from the recruitment draw when you're estimating those reference points or where you might go from here. And so kind of that shaded area, 1975 forward, are where the assessment uses those to kind of try to predict where we could and should go to. But you can see that most recent recruitments have been quite low, and that's part of our problem. And kind of what you use going forward, this 1975 forward or 2009 forward, and my boxes are approximate there, will kind of be part of the story that we get to a bit later. So just some of the short-term projections. These are using the full recruitment time series just in the initial or the assessment, kind of just again flagging that still, if we caught the quota in 2021, approximately double our fishing mortality target reference point there. And okay, so I'm going to pause. Dr. Rago, I think it'd be useful to hold off questions until Dr. Rago goes through, because some things might get answered. And I just built your slides into mine so I can advance them as you direct me.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Yeah, and thanks, Paul. So yeah, that's what we've been doing for the past couple of days. So I think that's a good plan on this. So Paul, whenever you're ready, go ahead and just ask Jason to forward the slides for you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Jason, for a very nice, comprehensive overview of the stock condition and so forth. What I will be presenting is the concerns raised by the SSC. This was a fairly intense set of discussions that we had during a fairly intense meeting. So it was it's always difficult to discuss bad news, and it's always kind of difficult to come back and say it's worse than we thought before. So in this case, just a little bit of background on the model itself. It relies on an age-structured model. One of the notable features of this is that it does use a Canadian egg survey as a metric of spawning stock biomass. The US and the Canadian stock assessments are basically joined at the hip in terms of both being synchronized and also in terms of the model formulations. We've had pulses in year classes as Jason described, but since 2008, they've been below the median, and 2015 was okay, so to speak, but 2016 was really one of the lowest ever. So there was a slight adjustment for the MRIP values. They went up substantially, so to speak, but since they constitute such a small part of the overall removals, they really didn't make a large difference in terms of rescaling the entire population. In terms of model performance, there was an analysis that did suggest that the natural mortality rate, which is assumed to be 0.2, actually has better support for a higher value of 0.26. So that's an important factor feeding into future projections on this resource as we start to think about that more deeply and try to see what makes sense in terms of longer term values. There's a strong retrospective pattern, and they've been increasing since 2017. And in particular, one that's problematic is that the recruitment estimate itself has a positive bias associated with it. So it is higher than actually subsequently confirmed when the models are updated. So that can lead to some over optimism there. Next slide, please. So based on the or compared with the previous benchmarks assessment, the perception of the stock has been revised substantially downward. The SSB in 2016 was revised downward by 29%. The MSY itself was reduced by 17%, and the projected biomass in 2020 is just 1/3 of the 2020 projections that were used as part of the benchmark assessment of 177,000 metric tons, so 60,000 versus 177. So there's a big disparity between what was initially projected and what was subsequently realized. Next slide, please. The whole topic of rebuilding consumed a great deal of SSC's time. And we'll be touching upon that later this afternoon in our joint discussions. But this provides sort of the species-specific context for some of those concerns. Now, from the 2017 benchmark, it was suggested that rebuilding was possible by 2023, even with modest increases in catches. When we updated it, when this was updated in the management track assessment, it was suggested that even if fishing mortality was zero, this 2023 rebuilding target date would not be achievable. No single factor can be identified as possible, but there was a small adjustment associated with the revised update of the 2015 year class. It went down 15%, but it's also notable that 2016 and later have been substantially lower than the 2015. There's also been a change in the median age of maturity. and a decrease in the weights at age. So all of this new revised context, as well as the updated information, suggests that a new rebuilding schedule is necessary beginning this year. And but the SSC noted there were many options, and a lot of the work that was done in advance. And thanks to Kirsten Curdy and Dave Secor, who's this SSC lead on this, and Jason for working jointly to sort of provide a huge range of projections in advance. But ultimately, it was determined that in the absence of some essential management guidance and so forth, it wasn't possible to sort of provide more concrete reference points and rebuilding trajectories. So next slide, please. So the SSC recommended separate actions for 2021 and 22. For 2021, it's expected that the stock will be subject to overfishing, given that the new estimate of the OFL for 2021 is 11,622. Therefore, the SSC recommends that measures be taken to eliminate or minimize additional catch during the current year. For 2022, the SSC recommends that that FMSY equal to 0.22 be utilized with a P star of 0.4, which would give an ABC of 8,760 metric tons. There are a set of assumptions related to that, which are that the catch in 2021 would equal 23,184, and that there would be a 4,000 ton Canadian quota removal. This P star of 0.4 is high. It's not what you would expect based on the current stock condition, which is substantially below 0.5 relative B over BMSY. And so it's just simply as an interim measure to while we start to engage or start the rebuilding process. Now, if we were to actually use the P star risk policy under and use the low quota or low recruitment scenario that is from the most recent stanza, the OFL, or excuse me, the ABC estimate would be 3,931 metric tons. Now, given that Canada takes or is expected to take 4,000 metric tons, that would mean total shutdown if that were implemented as part of the policy. Next slide, please. So under there we go. So all of this sort of begs the question, I guess perhaps unnecessarily, is why should the catches be reduced? Well, first of all, of course, the rebuilding plan is not going to meet the target. Long-term rebuilding period is likely. That is, we don't see this turning around quickly, especially given the recruitment estimates from the last several years. We're seeing a continued pattern of stock depletion, notwithstanding some of the increases that have occurred, as Jason showed in his graph, but still well below any of those dashed lines that represented either thresholds or targets. So we are roughly, just 1/3 of what we had predicted in the benchmark assessment from 2017. We note also that Canada reduced its quota by half, that is to 4,000 metric tons, to sort of jumpstart their rebuilding. But again, in the context of the entire resource, that still is a fairly substantial component of it. So the ability to control this within the current context, as Jason indicated, for 2021, there's not a whole lot that can be done, since even what has been taken is likely to constitute overfishing during that period. So there may be some minor adjustments as we get better or more refined estimates of what was actually taken in 2020. So next slide, please. So there are a lot of general rebuilding considerations. I won't belabor these too much. They are described in the SSC report, and page 8 through 8 through 13 has the sort of the critical discussions and so forth, and I've tried to condense them as much as possible here. However, you know, there are two kind of key sort of scientific parts to this. You know, so one is the minimum rebuilding time, T-min. So that was, you know, if we were to theoretically be able to set F equal to 0, this is sort of an expected minimum duration time for rebuilding, and then a maximum time is a policy decision, and it's either a 10-year period or some function of the rebuilding time if it happens to be greater than the rebuilding period of 10 years. So, for example, you add in the mean generation time. So there's that expectation. Another policy consideration is, you know, what is the probability of rebuilding, and that is a policy decision. You know, you basically constrained. You want it to be 50-50, but you know, there may be some value in shooting higher for that. So these balance here between science determined and council determined policies are really quite important. And then finally, there is this sort of feasibility of various metrics. So to what extent can measures that are beyond the control of the council or the US, and for that matter, you know, to what effect do they factor into the overall rebuilding? And so finally, next slide, please. Okay, so these are just, you know, there's a great deal of discussion within the document there, and we've touched on many of these already, but there is a concern, and it was mentioned that, you know, if the catches are reduced to really, really low levels, then there are some problems or concerns about, you know, being able to properly characterize the overall stock with respect to numbers and size at age and so forth. We remain concerned about, you know, what are appropriate recruitment assumptions. You know, one is, you know, when we do projections on rebuilding expectations, you know, if you use the entire time series, there may be some optimism there that is unwarranted based on recent patterns, and that follows that if it's warranted in the current stanza, do you expect that to go into the future? So the whole notion of what time period is relevant for definition of your reference points. So and then finally, the P-star control rules, as presently structured, are really kind of static quantities, and they don't have a time dimension associated with them. By that I mean, there's no guarantee that following a P-star control rule will be sufficient to ensure rebuilding. So you may implement them for 5 years and have rebuilding occur, or you may need 25 years in order for rebuilding to occur. So they do reduce the risk of overfishing, but they don't have a time dimension in there, and that time dimension is really stock specific. So it's not something you can simply generalize in terms of defining that. And then finally, a consideration that came up during the discussion was that under the ecosystem approaches to fisheries management guidance document that the council has adopted, forage species may require a more risk-averse harvest control rule. So that is another kind of policy layer or overburden associated with rebuilding of Atlantic mackerel. So I'll turn it back to Jason, and thank you very much for your attention.
So thanks. And the slide after this is kind of the pause for a question slide that I had, but there's kind of, obviously a key tension between, we have this rebuilding target to a stock size that assumes some higher recruitment, and then we have this lower recruitment that we've been experiencing. And if you assume that lower recruitment keeps occurring, it makes it very hard to get there. And of course, if one were to update the reference points to lower recruitment, on paper, it looks like easier rebuilding, but then you're stuck with a very low MSY as well. So that's not really that useful of a solution. You assume the higher recruitment, it looks like you're going to rebuild, but then, our experience suggests maybe we're going to underperform the projections. And this is just like a quick summary of some of the rebuilding projections, and without getting into all the details, the key thing here is that the dashed lines are the ones where you have the full recruitment time series that is used in kind of the assessment itself, and then the solid lines are when you're using the more recent recruitment. And the only situation where it rebuilds, the kind of the top solid blue line, is when you have zero catch. We've kind of talked about that. So that's kind of the conundrum that we kind of find ourselves in. Anyway, so I think it might be a good point to stop there for questions.
Okay, thanks, Jason, and thanks, Paul. Let's go ahead and see if anybody from the council has any questions for the presenters at this time. Michelle Duval, go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jason, that slide of projections that you just showed, were those based on, median likelihood? So in other words, 50% likelihood of achieving SSB?
These are essentially, yes. I mean, it's what the median projection would be if you had, each one of these lines assumes basically just a different catch trajectory, and then, what would be expected to occur on the different catch trajectories. The key thing being whether you assume kind of the median of the recruitment since 1975, the dashed lines, or you assume the median of the recruitment since 2009, the solid lines.
Yeah, thanks. I was really just curious, asking the question more to the point that Dr. Rago had made earlier about, the probability of rebuilding, and sort of the default tends to be, when we receive these projections, that, it's based on a median probability of, all of those runs that go into that particular projection. So thanks for that.
Yep, and these are not like the goal with these runs was more exploratory. It wasn't trying to say, what gives you a 50% probability or 75% or 60% probability of rebuilding. They're kind of exploratory, but yeah, no, I think it illustrates the point all the same. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Jason. Anyone else from the council have any questions at this time? All right, I don't see anyone from the council, but I do have Mary Beth with her hand up, so I can go to, let's go to Mary Beth. Go ahead, Mary Beth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I did have a question, and I don't know if it's really for the agency or for Jason, but hopefully somebody will be able to weigh in. And when I look at this, clearly there's a problem with this stock, and recent recruitment is quite low. And the conversation about using different time series for recruitment is useful, and sensitivity analysis are good. And when the council considers its risk, I think you need to look at it. However, I also think that given the assessment that was accepted in June, my understanding is that in that assessment, they used the longer time series, and those reference points that are key in the rebuilding program are also based on that as well. So it just gives me great pause when you have an assessment that was accepted, and then following that, you start to piece out parts of it that you're going to use, and other parts that you kind of go together don't necessarily. It just breaking it up that way is it's a concern. So I'm just wondering, relative to defining what the best available science is for this particular program would be, and in my way of thinking, it is that assessment, it's peer reviewed, and does the agency agree with that assumption? Perhaps I'm wrong.
And I think the peer review said that any of there were really three recruitments that were explored, but two of them are basically the same. So it's really the 1975 or the 2009 that matter. And the peer review of the assessment said that any of them are kind of objectively defensible. And I think the SSC has at least weighed in on what they think is best science, at least from a short-term perspective. And we will have some additional discussion, I think, coming up relative to a committee motion of, what, is there a way to kind of redirect and think more about, does the best science tell us, is there a particular recruitment that is most likely and should be assumed, or is it more about evaluating the risk of some different things? So we'll definitely kind of get into the weeds on this topic in a bit, but I see some other folks have their hands up also. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Mike Penny put his hand up. Mike, did you want to comment on Mary Beth's question?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Since she at least in part directed the question at the agency. So I think, and I agree with everything Jason said. I think, it's certainly a complicated issue, and we're going to get into some of this as we get through the discussion today. But I also think it's important, directly kind of to Mary Beth's point, that we keep in mind the context around the questions that are being asked. So certainly if you ask someone to do a stock assessment, they're going to be looking at the long-term horizon and long-term information. And it's perfectly reasonable for in that context to say, based on the information we have, we expect over the long term recruitment to revert to the mean, the long-term mean. And so we use the long-term mean. But in the case of deciding what next year's quota should be, does it make sense to assume that next year's quota should be based on the long-term average recruitment? We haven't seen anything close to it. Or does it make more sense to base next year's quota on recent recruitment, since we're talking about 1 year or 2 years worth of information? And so, I'm not going to give a definitive answer, because I can't really give a definitive answer. I think these are important factors for the council to consider and weigh for individual members. But I think the important point I'm trying to make is that when thinking about the information that was used and accepted as part of a peer-reviewed stock assessment versus the information that we want to base a short-term quota decision on, those don't have to be the same thing.
All right, thanks, Mike. Appreciate that. Let me see who I have. I'm getting some feedback here from Mary Beth. It looks like you're on. Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, if I could, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Of course, yeah, go ahead.
Just, you know, I understand what Mike just said, and I think that the councils do this all the time, relative to setting ABCs and certainly in the SSC. And somehow in my mind, the rebuilding program at the council is clearly setting their risk tolerance in that program. And it is somewhat different. And certainly you're looking out 10 years, and I guess maybe the way we define short term is perhaps different from person to person, but I do appreciate the answers. I'm still not sure that I feel totally clear, but it is helpful. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Mary Beth. I did see Paul Rago's hand go up. Paul, did you have
Yeah, if,
something you wanted to provide based on the question?
yes, if I may, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just in terms of the biological reference points, the SSC itself was very clear on that notion. And I direct you to page 12 of the SSC report, in which it says the SSC recommends that regardless of which recruitment time series is used for rebuilding projections, that the biological reference points continue to be derived from the longer assessed period, that is 1975 to the present. So that is the light blue stanza shown in front of you that Jason is showing. As Mike also characterized and appropriately, the rebuilding trajectory can in fact be based on more refined assumptions, such as using a more restrictive time series, in this case, the 2009 onward time series might be the most appropriate for at least some period of time until some future date when it might be more appropriate to say, okay, well, we either have enough evidence to confirm that this new state of nature is going to persist into the future, or that it has reverted back to the long-term mean, and then we can engage that full time series. But the expectation of or the sort of the joint effect of using a lower recruitment stanza for the initial rebuilding period and the longer term one in the latter part of the rebuilding period will in fact mean that those metrics of stock recovery, that is T-min or T-max, will in fact have longer duration than if they were simply a function of the overall initial time series. So there seems to be some flexibility that you can use two sets of assumptions, but in the long run, you're still sort of guided by the principle that you should use the longer time series until it can be established that that is in fact not an appropriate assumption for stock dynamics. So hopefully that's at least highlights some of the technical issues that the SSC dealt with. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Paul. Jason, I see your hand up. Go ahead, Jason.
One thing that I've kind of struggled with a little bit is, given some of the trajectories, how that kind of relates to some of Magnuson's exceptions for the 10 years. And it's except in cases where the biology of the stock of fish, other environmental conditions, or some international stuff that I don't think applies here, but it's really the biology of the stock of fish or other environmental conditions. And Paul, I mean, does it really have to be one or the other, or both of those things that really are restricting the kind of recovery path? It's either something about the biology of the stock of the fish or something about environmental conditions that are kind of leading to getting the low recruitment that's then driving kind of the slow rebuilding. Is that, accurate, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think we would probably need to bring in the author of the National Standard 1 guidelines to actually determine that. However, my understanding is that it would be you could make a more prudent sort of expectation about continuation of a low stanza of recruitment, and that may simply be something that's defined empirically based on some um, autocorrelation function, or the degree to which low recruitments tend to cluster together, as also high recruitments tend to do. So we could, I think, blend those two considerations together as part of a determination for what is a minimum and a maximum rebuilding period. But whether that's admissible under the law, or whether the law actually defined such considerations, I don't recall anything like that in my earlier readings of this thing, but perhaps that is modified in some way as you've characterized further.
And it may not really apply anyway, since it still appears to rebuild in 10 years with zero catch, which I think is the NS1 interpretation of when that exception might apply, but just kind of thinking big picture. Anyway, thanks for those
Right.
thoughts.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think if you had that graph with all the various trajectories on it there, that one, essentially what you might have is say the solid blue line that achieves rebuilding in roughly 2030 under the low time series, the low average there. If you were to determine in 2026 that it was more appropriate to use the long-term average, basically you'd have some transition between that solid blue line and that uppermost dashed blue line. So those, you'd be a transition there. So you might have a more quicker attainment of the rebuilding somewhere between 2030 and an earlier period, maybe 2027 or something, 2028. That's what the consequence of sort of a mixed mode assumption might be. But that is going to be this blend of both science and management that we're not well adapted for yet. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Thanks, Jason. Are there any other comments or questions from members of the council before I go to the public? Okay, seeing no hands, are there any members of the public that want to ask Jason or Paul a question regarding their presentation for us this morning or this afternoon? Okay, I don't see any hands from, okay, John Hare, Dr. Hare, go ahead. I just saw your hand pop up.
No worries, Mr. Chairman. I was looking for how to raise my hand for a little while, so I'm glad I found it in time. I just wanted to go back to Mary Beth's comment. Really appreciate the comments, Mary Beth. The recent assessment, the management track assessment, was peer reviewed, and then the peer review report and was briefed with the SSC and the SSC reviews. I just wanted to make it clear that the management track assessment that the council is looking at was peer reviewed. It was a level 2 peer reviewed under the management track assessment process.
Yeah, I appreciate that, John. Thanks for clarifying that for everybody based on the questions. Are there any other comments or questions at this time? Okay, so I think we're going to need to move into the next set of. Jason, did you have? I'm watching the screen. Did you have any more presentation that you wanted to give at this time?
Yeah, as we lead into potential council action, yeah, I do have a little additional present backgrounders.
Yeah, okay. So let's do that. Let's, we're going to start moving into council action, as Jason just mentioned. Jason, if you have a couple more slides you want to work through, that's great. And then we'll consider, our next steps. And Peter, I'm just going to put you on notice that, based on the discussion from last week, there, as we talked earlier, there are going to be some motions that are going to come before the council. So just be ready for that. So go ahead, Jason.
Thank you. So there are kind of two potential sets of actions for the council. Something on emergency action and then something on rebuilding. Do emergency action first. So Paul, we have the SSC recommendations, but in discussing with Garfo, they're not as binding with emergency action in terms of our traditional specifications process. And Magnuson has provisions for emergency action when you're creating or modifying a rebuilding plan that, if you're an emergency action doesn't necessarily need to end overfishing, but it needs to reduce overfishing, allow the stock to increase and mitigate economic effects. If you can make that argument, there's a little more flexibility. Also has to be based on best available science. And as part of that, the last EA did include a lower option that potentially could be built off of. This is kind of where we are currently, how option one, which I'll call the SSC option, and then option two, which is more or less building off of the lower range from the last EA, kind of potentially could look like. And if you're starting at the 8760 as more or less traditional ABC, deducting for Canada, US rec, expected rec catch, that's 5-year average. You're down to about 1,100 metric tons for a quota. If you're kind of building off and working backwards from kind of the lowest that was considered for a commercial quota in the last EA, that's the 7911. Add in recent discards to 809, add in rec catch to 3503 in Canada for 4,000. That totals about 15,512 metric tons. I think using the SSC's same methods, it is projected to would result in less overfishing than the current specifications. Also predicted to lead to slight biomass increases over the next few years, and would allow the council and industry a little time to kind of think about rebuilding. And again, this would be of these, it is the the second lowest kind of purple line is that 15,512. Even using the lower recruitment time series, you can see in 21, 22, it ticks up slightly. So just in terms of those emergency action requirements. So kind of from the committee's motion was that the council move forward with option two. The vote was 701, and touch on that one in a bit. Some key points from that before I kind of go over to the normal motions document. The maker of the motion kind of flagged the mackerel fishery is obviously under stress. There was definitely some concern about how moving forward with emergency action could delay the ILIX amendment. that's kind of working through the kind of standard environmental assessment review process right now. Expecting Garfo comments back on that, then kind of the ball being in my court working on those edits, and then there's some back and forth before rulemaking as we kind of hammer that out. But some other points with low herring quotas and research set aside, it seems unlikely that will be a relatively substantial fall mackerel fishery. Garfo encouraged the council to focus on what's best for the fishery. They flagged that they will vote no on any emergency action just to preserve the secretary's flexibility. Magnuson says that if there's a unanimous council decision for emergency action, the secretary must do it. So Garfo will kind of just vote no out of part of the process to preserve the secretary's flexibility. Magnuson says if it's not unanimous, then the secretary may implement it. So Garfo flagged, don't be surprised when Garfo votes no on any emergency action. So adding rec measures in emergency action would kind of really delay things that hasn't been previously contemplated. Would make the NEPA process more complex. There's general AP support for option 2 is providing kind of something for participants. Again, similar concern as the maker of the motion about slowing down progress on the LX permit action. Garfo has a fixed resources, and if there's emergency action, they will divert resources from other stuff to try to address that. And Garfo said they'll try to move both forward as quickly as possible, but they're working on a new thing that has some impact on everything else. And then we do get a public comment supporting option 2, given kind of the dominant impact of recruitment on driving things. So again, just coming back to what the committee motion was, I'm going to pop over. Whoops, what just happened there? I'm going to pop what happened here. Share content. I'm going to pop over to the motions. Document, and this, so then I'll turn to Peter for addressing this committee motion.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Can you make that a little bit bigger on your screen? Can you just expand it a little bit more? That's perfect. Oh, that looks great. I can even I can take my glasses off now. Okay, so we had a motion, and I'm going to turn to Peter Hughes, who chairs this committee. Peter, would you like to make this motion on behalf of the committee and read it into the record?
Mr. Chair, yes, I would like to do that. This is a committee motion, and I don't necessarily believe it needs a second.
No, there's no second. There's no second needed. I just wanted you to read it into the record on behalf of the committee, and then we'll move forward with discussion.
Thank you. The motion reads, move that the council move forward with option 2 for Atlantic mackerel emergency action as presented.
Okay, thanks, Peter. This is a motion made on behalf of the chair of the committee. It does not need a second. And so I will turn back to the council for any discussion on the motion. Please raise your hand. Please raise your hand. I'm sorry. I just got the hiccups all of a sudden. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just Jason already gave my preamble that I was going to give about the fact that I'll be voting no on any motion for emergency action to preserve the secretary's prerogative. But I also wanted to note that just so that everybody around the table is clear on this point, that we certainly appreciate the council selecting a specific alternative and providing advice for what measures or actions they wish the council wishes the agency to take. But unlike a framework adjustment or an amendment or even a specs package, we're not bound to the measures that are supported by the council. And so there's much more flexibility in the sense that if we first agree with the council, should this motion pass, that emergency or interim measures are appropriate and necessary, we then have a lot of flexibility as to what measures we might actually implement. Certainly want to defer to the expertise and advice of the council, but I just want people to be clear that a motion that passes the council for a specific outcome in emergency action does not obligate the agency to implement only that action should we agree with the council that emergency is warranted. Thanks.
Yeah, Mike, and to your point, just so everyone's clear, if there is a unanimous decision on emergency action, this is your point on flexibility, right? If there's if there's a unanimous decision, then the secretary does not have the flexibility. So therefore, the service, you'll vote against this to give the secretary flexibility. I just want to make sure that's clear for everybody. We talked about it a bit on the call last week, but just want to make sure everyone's clear on that.
Yeah, it's a little more nuanced than that. And this could probably be we could probably have a bunch of lawyers and have a 3-hour debate on this one point, but
let's please not do that.
Yeah, but if there were to be a unanimous decision, which there won't be because I'll be voting no, while the secretary may be obligated to take an action, I don't believe the secretary would be compelled to take only the action recommended by the council, but we would be obligated to take an action.
I see.
But
Okay.
with me voting no, then that's all moot, and the secretary may promulgate regs, and we defer, and we'll certainly be informed by the recommendations of the council, but not bound by them.
Okay. Yeah, and no offense to the attorneys that are on the call, but a group of attorneys having a 3-hour conversation over this is not anything I want to deal with at this point, but I appreciate that, Mike, very, very much. Let me go next to our liaison from New England, Mr. Eric Reed. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Pentney. So I just want to be clear that an emergency action, if you could refresh my memory on about how long it would take to enact an emergency action. And I believe the duration for the first period is 180 days, but it is renewable for another 180 days for the possibility of basically a year. And as far as the flexibility of the service, yeah, I'm not all warm and fuzzy about that flexibility, to be honest with you, but would that include possible rec measures in the EEZ?
So as to,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
okay.
Yeah, I was going to confirm that, Eric, you're correct on the 6-month provision on an emergency action once enacted. But go ahead, Mike.
Yep.
And then there is a year follow-up. There is another 6 months that can be, we've done this before. So before I get myself in trouble talking for the agency, let me go ahead back to Mike, who is much more knowledgeable about how this all works. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, that's all correct, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, as Eric stated, 6 months, 180 days for the first emergency action, and then an additional renewal for up to 186 days that gets us to a full year. In terms of the initial implementation, I think Jason stated this. Although we have flexibility under the Magnitude Act to implement emergency regulations, we are still bound by all of the requirements of NEPA, ESA, MMPA, and so we still have to do, and there still has to be an analytical document prepared, just like a council action, and we have to work through the rulemaking process on that. So it's unfortunately not something that we can be publishing an emergency action in a week, but we will certainly work with council staff to get any documentation that's necessary in shape so that we can move forward as quickly as possible. And then once we implement it, that starts the 180-day clock. I think there was a second piece to Mr. Reed's question, which I've forgotten.
Yeah, well, you might as well. I think I probably answered it myself. I asked if you could include rec measures in it. My understanding is including any rec measures which do not exist now would slow the time period for enactment of an EA by some amount, whether it's substantial or insubstantial. I honestly am not sure, and I don't even think it matters at this point. So my question is, at the end of 180 days, is it the same EA that has to go forward, or can it be tweaked or adjusted, or is there any flexibility at the end of 180 days?
Yes. It can be the same EA with the same measures that are simply rolled over for another 6 months, or if we, if we learn from what we did in the first 6 months and need to make some tweaks, I believe we have the flexibility to make those tweaks. But we would have to then, modify the analytical documents and potentially redo those as well.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, I support this motion, fully support this motion. I know national standard is in play here, in this particular fishery, but in my opinion, national standard 8 should be in play, the effect of communities of any action. We have to be mindful of socioeconomic concerns. So all that said, Mr. Luisi, if you want to remind me that I can't vote, go for it, Mike. But at this point, if I could, I would support this motion.
No, I appreciate that, Eric. And as I think you sent me a note today, so you are the sitting chair, right, from New England, or standing in until you have your next council meeting. I would love for you to be able to vote on this, but our process doesn't allow for that. So I appreciate your comments, though, very much.
Yeah, all right. Well, all that aside, Mike, I'm looking forward to the day you come to New England.
Yeah, well, once you guys have a meeting in person, I'll be back up there. I look forward to it. I appreciate it, Eric. Okay, let me see if I have any more hands on the motion. My screen just changed. It went back to the break. All right, there we go. So we're back to the motion by the committee. Are there any other comments or questions from members of the council before I go to the public?
This is Jason, just a quick flag, I think, in terms of timing, blue line tilefish was a little over 3 months from council action to emergency rule. And I think that's probably about as fast as could be possible. If everything aligns, things moved very quickly with that one. So that's just a corollary looking back in history of rough timing was 3 months and a couple of weeks.
Okay. And so that would put us, what's this, August, September, October, November? We'd be looking at the end of the year before this action could be taken up. Mike Penny, did you have something to add? I see your hand came back up.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I did have a thought, and then just a response to Jason's comment. Well, I can't predict how quickly we could get an emergency action implemented for mackerel this year. I wouldn't use tilefish as an example. We actually held that action because we wanted to make sure that we didn't want the 180-day clock to start in the prior fishing year. So we actually held the action so that it would publish at the same time as the specs. So I think we can do better than 3 months. I can't promise that we will because obviously staff resources are tight, and we have a lot of things that we have to do to prepare for the rulemaking. Yeah, Tilefish isn't necessarily the best example of timing. One point I wanted to just raise, because I recognize, and I'm not raising this as a legal concern or an agency position. I'm really just flagging this because I'm not sure people have thought this through, or at least I haven't heard a discussion. Maybe it's happened at the staff level, and Jason can address this, and I'd certainly appreciate hearing his response. There's one possible concern that I have with the timing, as I understand how the council is going to move forward. So option 2, which is what's before the council right now, would request that we put forward a 7,900 ton quota for next year, with the expectation, as Jason said, for the council to take a little more time to develop the 2022 specifications and submit those to us, say, in the spring for implementation next summer. There is at least the potential, given the advice of the SSC, as I understand it, that the council's recommendation for the 2022 specs to replace our emergency action could hover around that 1,100 metric ton, area. So my concern, or the question that I want to ask is, have people thought through what happens if the catch rates are similar to 2021, and by the time we are able to implement the council's follow-on specs action for 2022, say June 1st, the fisheries caught another 5,000 tons as they did this year. So if we implement a 7,900 ton quota as an interim emergency rule, that's fine. They're under that quota. But then the council would replace that with an 1,100 ton quota, and the industry would, on day 1 of implementation of the new specs, be almost 4,000 tons over. This isn't an agency position or even a concern. I just noted the sort of math in my head and wanted to ask the question if people have thought that through, and if there's a response or an explanation for how it can all still work. I'd really like to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Mike. I can turn to staff if staff have a response.
Yeah, I think, we don't know what exactly the outcome of the SSC's recommendations will be, especially, when we kind of get into, some of the discussions about the requests of tasking them to kind of think about the recruitment scenarios for rebuilding, and kind of doing the additional scientific deliberation that they said they needed. But yeah, I think in some just general brainstorming with Doug, yeah, I think this came up as a possibility, but I don't have any particular solution to it at this point.
So Mike, does that help with your question?
Well, not really. Because I think what it says is,
No, I want to make sure if there's no real just want to clear the air based on your question.
yeah, I guess it's something that occurred to me, and it's something that I think we all need to think through, the potential implications of that. I think where we don't want to end up in a situation is, we implement emergency action at the request of the council moves forward in due haste for replacement specs based on the advice of the SSC, and we put the fishery in a position of then having, at those lower rebuilding levels, to pay back an overage for 2 or 3 years with no fishery. So I just want to make sure that people have thought that through, and maybe I'm making too much of this, and it's really not as big a risk as it appears like it could be, just strictly looking at the numbers.
Totally understood. I appreciate it. Thanks, Mike. I do have a few hands, so Mike, I'm going to assume you're going to put your hand down. Jason, did you have a follow-up? And then I have Eric Reed again.
It would take some more staff to have this discussion. Two potential solutions that come to mind immediately would be that, the rebuilding plan is really designed to start 2023. Another one would be just conditioning the rebuilding plan on that catch in 2022, which means that in order to rebuild in a certain time period, the future stream of catches is going to be somewhat lower. But those are, I think, two potential ways to deal with it that would kind of address that issue.
Okay, thanks, Jason. No, I appreciate that. Eric Reed, did you have a follow-up based on this discussion?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, I do. I mean, I agree there's a lot of numbers floating around, and the numbers I look at are what are we going to catch between now and the end of the year? And my guess is, given the low participation in the herring fishery, because there's low numbers there, the possibility with option one that the fishery is going to go to 1,300 tons plus or minus, which is no fishery anyway, and the MRIP data that says the rec fishery catches 3,500 tons. I look at those numbers, and I listened to Dr. Rego, and I realized that this is new ground. Everybody said it's new ground for the SSC, but he's talking about flexibility and the blend of science and management, and I have a lot of confidence that we're going to figure this out. And I don't drive boats anymore, but I would much prefer rolling the dice on this than going with option one. That's my position, and I'm sticking with it.
Okay, I appreciate that, Eric. Was that a motion? Did you want to make that motion as a substitute, or are you just making comment regarding what is before us right now?
I don't. I'm just made a comment. I'm just pointing out that option one is in my mind presents no fishery, and option two presents the option to be flexible and warm and fuzzy and all this other stuff. And I would much prefer to roll the dice on option two. So I fully support the motion, as I've said before.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, I appreciate that, Eric. Okay, let me see if I have any other hands at this time. Does anyone else from the council have anything that they want to offer for comment on the emergency action motion before us? Okay, seeing no hands coming to the top of the screen, I'm going to go out to the audience before we call the question on this vote. Is there anybody from the public that would like to offer any comment regarding the motion before us at this time? I have Greg DiDomenico. Go ahead, Greg.
Mr. Chair, we can support option two. Thank you very much.
That was the quickest comment I think you've ever made, Greg. I've known you for a long time, but I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Anyone else from the public want to offer anything to the emergency action motion before us at this time? Okay, coming back to the council. Let me ask one last time. Anyone from the council have any comment they want to make before we call the question? And I realize that Mike Pentney, as he mentioned before, is going to vote this down, so I'm not going to call for a motion. I'm not going to call the motion for consensus. So I think we need to take a vote on this, which is our practice. So seeing no hands, I'm going to go ahead and read this motion into the record, and then I'll call the question. So if everyone can get ready to raise their hand when necessary, the motion is to move that the council move forward with option 2 for Atlantic Mackerel emergency action as presented. The motion was made on behalf of the committee, and I'm going to ask now for hands of support for that motion. I'm having a little trouble with the count here, just a little different on my computer. Jason, do you have a count that you can pass on?
Yeah, I show 18-4.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, when I try to scroll down, it goes so fast I lose my place.
I am able
okay.
on that participant bar, I am able to like extend it if I grab the bottom of it, and you might be able to make it take up a bigger part of your screen.
Yeah, I mean, it clears the whole screen, but when you have
Okay.
18 people, yeah,
Okay.
it just, I was trying to scroll through and it was all too fast. So, okay, well, if you've called 18, I'll go ahead and call that 18 in favor. If we can put the hands down at this time. Okay, seeing no hands at this time, I'm going to call, well, Tom, you have your hand up. Are you in opposition? Okay, Tom's hand just went down. Let's go ahead. I'm going to ask for anybody on the council opposed to this option. Okay, I see one hand, Mr. Pentney. Are there any abstentions to the motion? Okay, seeing no hands. So we have a motion that carries 18 to 1 to 0 for abstentions. And we can move on from here. I'm going to turn it back to you, Jason.
Okay, I'm just got a slight. Is there anything on the screen right now?
What I see right now is, oh, it just went blank. You had your Word document up and now it's just blank. It's just a black screen.
Okay, let's try. Oh, hold on. Let's see what happens here. Okay, hold on for a second. Okay. Do you see rebuilding V2 at the top now?
Yep, that's what we see now. At least
Great.
that's what I see. So I think
Okay.
we're good to go.
Thank you. So as kind of Dr. Rago described, SSC has indicated rebuilding is likely to be a long-term endeavor. They kind of flagged that just 50% probabilities of rebuilding, kind of essentially a coin flip, whether or not you've rebuilt in any given time period is kind of risky. Staff memo kind of suggested focusing on 10-year rebuilding, given that, and kind of a range of rebuilding probabilities. And then recommending that the council request that the SSC provide some recommendation on what to assume for recruitment through the rebuilding time period that would most closely achieve the targeted rebuilding probabilities, and also some information on at what point do you kind of throw in the towel that you think there actually has been a regime change and when reference points maybe should be updated. Another question is, what's the council's risk preference in terms of what's assumed for 2021 in those rebuilding projections? Again, I'm right at this point, I'm just kind of summarizing some of the staff memo. Potentially directing staff to try to develop some recreational measures such as a moratorium in federal waters. And since there's not much limited ways to affect catch, given a lot of it's occurring in state waters, also including some kind of river herring and shad cap options. And so at the committee, we went through and reviewed things similarly as we did today. So the first motion from the committee was that the council requests, and again, the ... are the committee recommends that the council, but what it comes down to is that the council requests analysis and alternatives for 50, 60, and 75% rebuilding probabilities associated with a 10-year rebuilding timeline, a quick canvas by staff of some other councils' rebuilding plans. I did see some that appear to be striving for a 60 or 75% rebuilding probability. Wasn't quite sure exactly how they quantitatively derived that they thought those probabilities would exactly be achieved, but that's what they're shooting for. That was a motion from the committee. It was by consent. Some other key points, kind of the rationale from the motion maker that some options above the standard median 50% probability appear warranted, kind of given the results we've had so far. There was some discussion of whether or not the P-star calculations would still be done, and I think they would still be done as an option. The risk policy kind of defaults to P-star if you're in a rebuilding plan and P-star is lower. So I think that because of those provisions, pretty much they have to be included as an option, so the council could see that also. And anything that involves higher catches in P-star has to kind of have by de facto a risk policy adjustment, given the standing risk policy defaults to P-star if P-star is lower than some rebuilding catch. So again, this is was agreed to from the committee by consent. I'm going to stop sharing this and go back and share the motions document. And those are just all the motions from committee. Make this a little bigger. Oops. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jason. I appreciate that. So let's go ahead. I'm going to go back to Peter Hughes to read this motion for committee into the record, and then we'll go ahead and have a discussion on it. Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move that the council request analysis alternatives for 50%, 60%, and 75% rebuilding probabilities associated with a 10-year rebuilding timeline. And I hope you didn't hear that truck.
No, I didn't hear anything. That's fine. Thanks, Peter. And so this motion is made on behalf of the committee, which does not need a second. Is there any discussion on the motion? Dr. Duvall, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I will confess that I was the maker of this motion in committee, and I do think that given the forage role of Atlantic mackerel in the ecosystem, and some of the references that Dr. Rega made to the council's EAFM guidance document, I do think it would be prudent for us to examine higher probabilities of rebuilding. I think both for the stock as well as for the fisheries so that we can, hopefully have a higher likelihood of success. I mean, I fully recognize that, this assessment, changed our understanding of the stock quite substantially, and, given that, even with catches being well below, the most aggressive rebuilding plan that the council had previously considered, as, Jason noted earlier. So I just, I think given some of the experiences in other regions with rebuilding, I just think it's really prudent that we consider this range of options that includes something above a median likelihood. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. I certainly appreciate that. Is there anyone else from the council that would like to weigh in on the motion before us? Okay, seeing no hands at this time, other than Michelle's, I'm going to assume she'll put that down in a second. There we go. Is there anyone from the public that would like to offer any comment regarding the motion before the council at this time? Okay, again, I see no hands, so I'm going to go ahead and bring it back to the council. I'm going to read this motion into the record and call the question. So the motion is move that the council request analysis alternatives for 50%, 60%, 75% rebuilding probabilities associated with a 10-year rebuilding timeline. This motion was made by Peter Hughes on behalf of the committee. Is there any objection to the motion? Are there any abstentions to the motion? Okay, seeing none, it appears that this motion will pass by consent. Thank you again. I know how many more motions do we have, Jason? I saw your screen earlier. We have a couple more, right, to go through?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to turn it back to you to present. Do you have presentations in between each one?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to turn back to you, and we'll take up the next motion after hearing your presentation. Thank you.
So the next one was that the council requests the SSC perform additional analyses regarding recruitment assumptions and reference points to inform rebuilding decisions. This is another by consent motion from the committee. I think the just point here, ties together a lot of what we've discussed earlier, but the interpretation of staff from this is that the SSC would be asked, whether the best available science supports a particular recruitment assumption is most probable over the course of rebuilding, and that assumption doesn't necessarily need to be static. And if not, something in particular provides some information on the relative risk of using different recruitment assumptions to again inform, whether science says this is most likely, or science can say these are at least some descriptions of risk. I'm not exactly sure what the outcome might be there, but that would be the charge to SSC. I think that we've already had some discussions with some center staff about, the herring, looked at some autocorrelated things, probably have some discussions with some SSC folks about, a couple different ways to potentially look at recruitment. Again, it may be something that spills out into another SSC meeting, and that obviously would affect, final council decision making. But the goal would be, bring it back to the SSC in September and see if we can get some advice in this fashion. And then same thing on the reference points about, is there, at what point would some regime change be apparent to trigger a revision of reference points? Get some additional thoughts from them on that. So again, just back to the motion, and going to stop sharing this and start sharing the motion document. And a little bigger. And that's it. Thank you.
All right, Jason, thanks. That looks great. Let's go ahead. I want to turn back to Peter to make this motion on behalf of the committee. So Peter, if you can read that into the record, that'd be great.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Move that the council request the SSC perform additional analysis regarding recruitment assumptions and reference points to inform rebuilding decisions.
All right, thanks, Peter. Like I've mentioned before, this is a motion on behalf of the committee. It does not need a second. Is there any discussion on the motion from members of the council? Okay, seeing no hands, is there anyone from the public that would like to make any comment regarding the motion? Okay, seeing no hands there either, we'll bring it back to the council. Is there any opposition to the motion? Seeing no opposition, is there any abstentions to the motion? Are there any abstentions to the motion? Seeing no abstentions or opposition, motion passes by consent. Back to you, Jason.
Okay, the third or a third, I may have changed the order a little bit up, but so a third, that the council consider and analyze an alternative that would mimic the butterfish regulations for the mackerel fishery. Rather mimic the, I have to change my intonation there, mimic the butterfish regulations for the mackerel fishery. And that would be a 3-inch or greater minimum mesh size required to retain more than 5,000 pounds of mackerel. That's how the butterfish regs are set up for really directed butterfish fishing currently. And that is a vote 6-0-0 for that particular at the committee. Kind of key points, the rationale from the maker was to allow some smaller fish to escape more to try to build mackerel recruitment numbers over time. Yeah, I think again, as some rebuilding options related to those probabilities, so it'll be kind of a suite of the typical closure mechanisms and things like that that would apply to quotas based on standard practices, but this would be kind of an additional supplemental measure for consideration. I think there's some discussion by staff that there's not a whole lot out there for selectivity for Atlantic mackerel or other mackerel. So it may be hard to say whether or not this may be practicable for the fishery or may have much of any impact on mackerel selectivity and retention of small fish. But staff can potentially try to dig through some observer data to see if there's something in there. So, so I'm not quite sure what information we'll be able to bring to bear on this, and that may restrict the council's ability to select this in the end. But it's something that staff can try to take a look at. So the motion again is there. Whoops. And we'll go back to the motions document. I'm not quite sure what I did with my keystrokes there, but are you seeing the motion Word document now?
We are.
Thanks.
Yeah, it looks good. And it's big enough I can take my glasses off, which is great. So, okay, so we have a motion that was made by the committee. You saw the vote by the committee. I'm going to go back to Peter Hughes to read this into the record. and then we'll have a discussion on this motion. Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Move that the council consider and analyze an alternative that would mimic the butterfish regulations for the mackerel fishery. 3-inch plus or greater, I guess, minimum mesh required to retain more than 5,000 pounds.
Okay, thanks, Peter, for that motion. You know, so I do have a question on this one. So based on what Jason said, that there might not, I'm trying to interpret all this information. So while there might not be a lot of information here, Jason, what do you think the staff time would be as far as resources go into exploring this?
I mean, again, I think my thinking would be that if this passes, I would take a quick, a quick look at the observer data, coordinate with center staff to kind of a bit to see if they, think my look at it was reasonable, and, and leave it at that. And so what, the observer data will suggest what it suggests. Do a little more lit review. So I think as long as the council knows that it may be an unlikely, it may not be able to provide anything useful. But I think we can take, I think I can take a quick look at it without
Okay.
causing other workload problems.
Okay, yeah, that works for me. I'm sure that works for Chris as well. Yeah, I mean, just to answer the question, even if you come up with nothing or something that's, I think that, exploring it is a good idea. So I'm going to support the committee on this. Peter Hughes, I do have your hand still up. Did you have anything you wanted to add to this before I go to Eric?
Well, I do, and I did just raise my hand, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I mean, I fully support this motion, but I do have a little bit of concern about what the cost to industry would be for everybody to have to change their mesh size in their nets. But doing a little bit of research, I've come to the understanding that there are some areas that are already utilizing 3-inch mesh in this fishery. So, I fully support the motion for analysis. Thank you.
Yeah, and I was going to say the same thing too, Peter. Support for analysis is a lot different from support for implementation. So, depending on what Jason comes up with, we'll have that opportunity to discuss with the AP and the committee in moving forward with whether or not this is going to be something that is implemented. So, I appreciate those thoughts. Let me go next to Eric Reed, and then I have Dan Farnham, and then Jeff. I'll come out to the public here as soon as I get through the council members. So go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I support this motion. The cost to the industry will certainly affect some, but it will not affect others. And the idea here is to try to be proactive and allow increased escapement of the gear for especially the smaller fish. And I agree that there's not a lot of literature on Atlantic mackerel and mesh selectivity. There was a study done by Casey et al. On the West English Channel, but that was for 40 millimeter knotted diamond bags versus 60 millimeter square bags. But there is information for the horse mackerel fishery, which it's a horse of a different color, I suppose, but off of the coast of West Africa. So I would suggest you reference that information as well. And, as far as the 40 versus the 60-inch research by Casey et al., a 3-inch mesh is 76 millimeters. That's a big mesh. Fish are going to get out of that. So I support the motion.
Okay, thanks, Eric. We go next to Dan Farnham. Go ahead, Dan.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also support this motion. I envision a 3-inch mesh just cod end size. I don't know if if it makes a difference. The way it's written right now, that would be throughout the length of the net, or what is, any thoughts on that, anybody?
Yeah, thanks, Dan, for that question. I'll have to go to Jason and others that were part of this discussion. This is part of the discussion that I missed the other day. Jason, do you have anything you want to offer to that question?
I think Eric was thinking cod end, but I might turn to him to clarify.
If I might.
Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I mean, the motion is to mimic the butterfish regs. You know, I left it at that, but I would certainly assume that if this motion were to pass, the analysis may consider the tail piece and the bag, you know, or mackerel brailers, etc. But I wanted to start somewhere. So the butterfish regulations are in place, which means that gear is in place on boats. So that's why I went down this road to start.
Okay.
It is cod
Yeah.
end in the butterfish regs.
Yeah, I believe so. X amount of meshes in the bag, 3 inches.
Yeah, and you guys are a lot better. You have a lot more expertise as to the details of the fishing gear. So thanks for that clarification, Eric. Let me go back to Dan. I think it was Dan. Didn't you does that help you with the question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The only reason I
Okay.
put that up, I envisioned the cod end myself, but for going back to Peter Yu's thoughts, that the cost would be a lot less to just replace a cod end as compared to replacing the tail piece or other section of the net. That's why I brought it up.
Or the whole net, yeah. Okay, well, no, I appreciate that. If this motion passes, we will see what the analysis is. Just like I said before, we're not saying this is going to be a done deal. It's just an analysis that we'll get a further report on. So does anyone else from the council would like to make any comments regarding this at this time before I go to the public? Eric Reed, your hand's still up. Did you have a follow-up?
No, sorry, Mike, I'm done.
Okay, all right, thanks. I just wanted to make sure. Okay, so let me go to the public at this time. People who participated in this discussion earlier, or I guess last week. I'm going to start with Jeff Kalin, then I have Jerry O'Neill, and then Mary Beth Tooley. So go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, council members. Jeff Kalin with Lund's Fisheries in Cape May, New Jersey. And we've been in the pelagic fisheries for a long time. And, like the New England Council Chair, it's been a long time since I've been a boat driver also. But I do know over the years, there's been a lot of discussion in the mackerel fishery about the use of the mackerel brailer. And I think with the pelagics, a cod end is sort of referred to as a brailer more frequently because you tend to brail pelagic fish from a net into boats, kind of historically. So the mackerel brailers are out there, and they do absolutely reduce the catch of smaller fish. And for over the last several years, we've all known that, but to try to get consensus in the fleet to all use a mackerel brailer without regulation, frankly, has been impossible. So, I think this is something whose time has come. If you put 3-inch twine in the whole net, you'd never be able to tow the net. Some of the forward mesh in some of these high flying nets are meters wide, I believe. I haven't been out offshore myself for a long time, but you can't run 3-inch mesh through an entire herring trawl. So or mackerel trawls. So I just wanted to introduce the idea that the industry does have mackerel brailers. Whether or not they're 3 inches or not, Mr. Chairman, I really don't know. I'm sure that Jason can analyze that question by reaching out to some of the mackerel fishermen that are on the AP. You know, myself, I haven't checked with our gear people, but I don't think this is a heavy lift. I don't think it's a lot of money. If you're just talking about the brailer or maybe even the extension piece, I'm not sure. But anyway, I want to make those comments. I do think this is something, this is the right time to do this, given where we are with the stock, and probably something we should have done a number of years ago. So thank you for allowing me to make those comments.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And to your point, I think, you know, this is just an exploration and analysis that we'll get some feedback from. So I appreciate your thoughts. Let me go next to Jerry O'Neill. Go ahead, Jerry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're coming through loud and clear. Go ahead, Jerry.
Good. No, I just had really, I would definitely support analysis of this. I have a suggestion though. I mean, if there's not a lot of data out there, it might be beneficial to reach out to the AP and some industry members, especially, well, not especially, but like some of us are using macro broilers, some of us are not. But one thing where the majority of us are doing is landing our fish to certain production facilities. So there could be a lot of data out there that doesn't get used. I mean, I've said this numerous times about different fish that we deal with, that, you know, we have data in our facilities from QC reports on the sizes of fish, fats, histamines, all the rest of it, that if you find out which boats are landing, we can track it back to the boat that caught the fish. And if they're using macro broilers, you should see a difference in what's getting landed. Based, if you could use the data from the plants. It's anecdotal, I mean, to some degree, but I think there could be a real benefit in getting some data on that, and whether or not the fish that's getting caught with the different broilers would have an impact on recruitment or not. So just I wanted to say that. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment, Jerry. I'm going to go next to Mary Beth Tooley, and then Megan Lapp, you'll be after Mary Beth. Go ahead, Mary Beth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly support the comments made by the industry prior to mine here, and we do use mackerel broilers. I do think exploring it is a good idea, and you know, we don't know if the regulations in butterfish match up, but I think there's time to figure that out. So those would be my comments. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mary Beth. You almost beat Greg DiDomenico as far as comments, but he still has the upper hand on everybody at this point with his quick comments earlier. Go ahead. So Jerry and Mary Beth, if you can put your hands down, unless you have a follow-up that you wanted to ask. I saw, okay, both hands are going down now. Megan Lapp, go ahead, Megan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan Lapp, Sea Freeze. We also support this analysis. Our vessels do have mackerel broilers, so I think it's a good idea to explore as part of a rebuilding framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Appreciate that. Is there anyone else from the public that would like to offer any comment regarding the motion before the council at this time? All right, seeing no other hands, I'm going to bring it back up. I'm going to bring it back to the council. Peter Hughes, go ahead, Peter.
Thanks. And this is just maybe for Jason, that maybe we reach out to our partners in the pelagic community over in Europe, Jason, and I don't know who's still there. I don't know if Jens is there, or oh, I forget the gentleman's name. And see if they have any research in regards to the 3-inch mash, or they'd use millimeters probably. So that's all. Thanks.
Thanks. Likely another good source of info.
Yeah, thanks for that, Peter. I'm going to look to you guys, people in the industry for this type of information. It's a little bit more than what I deal with on a day-to-day. So I appreciate the comment. Okay, so seeing no other hands raised at this time, I'm going to go ahead and read the motion into the record and then call the question to the council. The motion is move that the council consider and analyze an alternative that would mimic the butterfish regulations for the mackerel fishery, open parentheses, 3-inch plus minimum mesh required to retain more than 5,000 pounds, close parentheses. Motion made on behalf of the committee. Is there any objection to the motion? Are there any abstentions to the motion? Seeing no objection and no abstention, motion passes by consent, and we can go ahead back to Jason to continue working through this document. Go ahead, Jason.
Another motion from the committee was that the council include an alternative analysis of a 10-inch Atlantic mackerel minimum size limit for the recreational fishery, in addition to measures described in the staff memo. It passed by consent. So the rationale was that it's similar to Canada's 26.8 centimeter size limit, which is based on maturity data. And again, that would be in addition to a potential federal waters closure, kind of as discussed as one of the few kind of direct options that that the council has. There was a question, could the same be done with chub mackerel or a combined limit or in terms of size limit, given a similar appearance? Did have some discussion with Julia here. There wasn't a particular biological reason for it for chub mackerel, but if it was an enforcement kind of concern, that's a possibility. The council could potentially include it for one or both in this framework. It wasn't part of the motion, but staff could be kind of directed to consider it for Atlantic mackerel or both. There's also questions about, could the states be requested to kind of follow suit in some fashion? I did reach out and heard back from Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts. So over, I think, 95% of the Atlantic mackerel catch is from those states. They indicated they could theoretically do measures in 3 to 4 months, depending on other scheduling, other advisory panels, when they're meeting, things like that, and just requested that they be included in any relevant discussions of that topic. And I think several of them kind of joined on this call so they could kind of get up to speed on mackerel after my email back and forth with them. So again, this is the motion that the committee passed. I'll go back to the motions document. And that's it from me on this motion.
Yeah, that looks good, Jason. Let's go ahead to Peter as chair of the committee. Peter, do you want to read this into the record?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move that the council include an alternative and analysis of a 10-inch Atlantic mackerel minimum size limit for the recreational fishery, in addition to measures described in the staff memo.
All right, thanks, Peter. Are there any comments on the motion? Joe Semino. Go ahead, Joe.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I didn't have a chance at the committee meeting to comment on this, although I support it. I had to jump on the phone and I wasn't able to speak through the phone at the time. As I said, I support the motion, but something Jason mentioned I think is important, and that's reaching out to the states. I think here, unlike the regional administrator's comments on timing, there is a fair comparison to tilefish. Early on, before it was incorporated into the Mid-Atlantic's FMP, some of the southern states at the time I was in Virginia recognized blue line tilefish catch was exceptionally high, and we worked hard to deal with that, even though it wasn't part of an FMP we were a part of at the time. And given the stock status here and our concerns, I would hope the states would be reactive. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Joe. Any comment from staff on Joe's comments? All right, seeing no hands. Are there any other questions or comments from council members on the motion before us? Okay, seeing none, coming to the top of the screen. Anyone from the public that would like to offer anything in comment to the motion before the council? Jerry O'Neill. Go ahead, Jerry.
Hi, Mr. Chair. I actually just had a question about this, and I didn't mean to bring it up at the meeting last week, but to be honest with you, I just didn't get to it. But this is only recreational. Does this include the jig fishery at all? That's been coming on stronger every year for the last few years, or is it just literally just recreational?
Jerry, that's a detail that I'm not sure of. I can ask staff. I can ask Jason how the supplies, or maybe Peter, as committee chair, would have something to offer. But I don't have that answer for you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think the motion is specific to the recreational fishery. And I think the jig fishery that Jerry is referring to is a commercial fishery.
It's commercial, right? Okay. Okay. Does that help you out, Jerry?
Yeah, I guess it does. I don't know if there's any way to analyze that jig fishery. I'm not sure there's any data out there for what's coming in.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Jerry. I appreciate your question. Let's see if we have any other hands at this time. I don't see anything. Is there anybody else from the public that wants to offer any comment regarding the motion before I bring it back to the council? Okay, seeing no hands at this time. Is there anyone on the phone? I try to do this, but I've forgotten. Anyone on the phone that wants to offer any comment? Go ahead and speak up. I should have been suggesting that all along. It's my fault. I know people are just on the phone. They can't see what's happening. So seeing nobody, and Jason didn't. Go ahead, Jason. I see your hand just popped up.
Yeah, I mean, I think at some point that could be analyzed in terms of that jig fishery, but given kind of the timelines we're working on right now, I'd suggest kind of maybe parking that for future consideration in terms of the jig fishery. I think it's going to make, I think it's just going to be, it's just, anyway, given the timeline, and I think it's better to hold off for, maybe a future kind of planned task, because I think it's going to involve some digging.
Okay, but that does not, your suggestion and comment does not go against what this motion is from committee, right?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Jason. Appreciate that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I know we just read the motion in. I'm going to read it into the record one more time, and then I'm going to call the question. The motion is move that the council include an alternative and analysis of a 10-inch Atlantic mackerel minimum size limit for the recreational fishery, open parentheses, in addition to measures described in the staff memo, close parentheses. Motion made on behalf of the committee. Are there any objection to the motion? Okay, seeing no hands, Are there any abstentions to the motion? Okay, seeing no hands for objection or abstention, the motion carries by consent. And I'm going to go back to Jason. I think we have, is there one more motion? Or are there two more?
I think there's one more from committee. There may be one other little issue to contemplate also after the
Okay.
committee motions.
Okay. Yeah, let's go ahead and take care of this one, and then we'll move on from there. Thanks, Jason.
So the last one from committee was regarding the river herring and shad cap, and there's a motion to council include an alternative analysis of using no less than 129 metric ton for the river herring shad cap throughout the rebuilding timeline. Past 700. Key points for this: the rationale from the maker was that lower amounts would be unrealistic, unmonitorable, and ineffective. Kind of noted during discussion that the current scaling process would also be included as an option. That scaling process is used by the council so far is kind of scaled up or down with the quota. AP members noted there's a good bit of discussion on this one. Kind of likely lower scale of river herring and shad catches in general at the lower mackerel herring quotas we have right now. Some folks flagged that New England Council has kind of maintained their cap, not scaled it down as herring quotas were reduced. Kind of on the flip side, though, the Mid-Atlantic's cap has been kind of designed as an incentive to avoid river herring and shad at any mackerel quota level. Had a lot of discussion of this over the years where kind of New England is kind of focused on capping at a certain absolute quantity, while the Mid-Atlantic's cap is more in terms of target ratio. So that's the alternative. I think based on my general knowledge of how the cap has performed over the years, I think there is some risk of very rapid closures based on previous year's data when the cap gets low. So I think this is a pretty reasonable thing to include analysis and consideration of, because of how we've kind of observed the cap operating over the years. And that is it. And I will go back to the motion document.
Okay,
Back to
thanks,
you.
Jason. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up and putting that motion up before us. I'm going to go back to Peter Hughes to make that motion on behalf of the committee. Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move that the council include an alternative and analysis of using no less than 129 metric tons of the river herring shad cap throughout the rebuilding timeline.
Okay, thanks, Peter. And as I've mentioned before, this is a motion on behalf of the committee. It does not need a second. Are there any discussions on the motion? Michelle Duval, go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so, just given the discussion that we had about this motion, and thanks to Jason for confirming that, the status quo approach would also be included as an option. Jason, I was curious. I know when we talked about this back in February, there were a couple, just about the shad and the river herring and shad cap, there were a couple of requests. I think one involved like reaching out to the Science Center to help, I think, synthesize some survey information, if possible, to, look at recent river herring and shad abundance trends. And I think there was another one related to like revenue maps based on some spatial analysis you did. And I was just curious if you had any updates on those requests. Thanks.
Sure, yeah. The center completed those revenue analyses, and so that I'll include those in the kind of river herring and shad update that was slid to October. And the other one was, could some meta-analyses of survey data be used towards making progress towards, moving the catch cap from kind of a let's try to do better than we did over this reference point to something that's more tied to the biology and abundance of river herring and shad. The center has hired a new kind of river herring and shad lead. Kirsten Curdy was doing that analysis before. She's been 100% max pedal to the metal on herring and black sea bass assessment work. So I think we're kind of still starting to have those conversations with the center about, and that was really just to kind of scope it out for maybe some future project. But so the revenue is done, will be presented, and we'll kind of start to have some of those discussions on the other topic.
Thanks, Jason.
All right, thanks, Jason, for that. Peter Hughes, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm supportive of this motion, and let's not forget that it's for analysis only for the document. That's why I support this motion. So thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point, Peter. I appreciate that. Before I go out to the public, let me see if there are any other members of the council that have any questions at this time. Yeah, I don't see any hands. So I'm going to go out to the public. Mary Beth Tooley, go ahead, Mary Beth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just had one thought that I was hoping the staff could look at in this process here, and that is just the actual program and its implementation and what that means. And just a little vague description here, but I'm not sure that the council members all understand how it actually operates in the fishery. If you had a biological data point and you adjusted your cap based on that biological information and you had even distribution across the fishing grounds, that would make sense. That's not how it operates in the fishery. The fish presence and absence of river herring is environmentally driven, and one vessel could have a hit on river herring, and that ratio will get applied to every trip after that until other data comes in. We don't have 100% observer coverage. The presence and absence of the fish is not evenly distributed. And just so that the council, understands what the implications of that are and why people make the comment, if you go too low, it's not manageable. I think that would be helpful. So thank you.
All right, thanks for your comments, Mary Beth. I'm going to go next to Pam. Go ahead, Pam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the council. This is Pam Lyons-Groman with Wild Oceans. And just thinking a little bit about what Mary Beth just said, we do have now an industry-funded monitoring amendment. I know that's for the herring plan, but part of the reason that this council decided not to pursue industry-funded monitoring was because of the overlap between the two fisheries, believing that we would get increased observer coverage for the mackerel fishery. And I just want to know if we still believe that that will be the case now that that monitoring program is going to be implemented. And the reason this is important is because river herring and shad bycatch is episodic, but you can have large events when they occur. So if you don't have an even level of observer coverage, you are perhaps missing some things, or maybe you're overestimating. And those are problems when you're trying to estimate where you are in relation to the cap. So I'm curious if Jason could comment on projected future levels of observer coverage. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Pam. Go ahead, Jason, if you have a comment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly how coverage will look once that the industry funded observing and portside sampling and that whole thing is kind of fully implemented. I think we're just gonna have to see what implementation looks like for a bit and then kind of make another decision. I think at the very low quota levels that may kind of further complicate one's ability to discern what kind of coverage you'd expect at kind of more historic levels of fishing. So I'd say I don't know, and I would certainly be kind of observing how implementation works out of that program.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Pam, your hand went down. Did you have any follow-up with Jason on that? Just thought I'd ask.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, that covers it. I do think it's something that I would appreciate the council keeping an eye on, because it certainly is very important when it comes to the effectiveness of this river herring and shad cap. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Pam. Appreciate it. Good to hear your voice. Okay, so I don't see any more hands from the public. At this time, I'm going to bring it back to the council. Anyone want to make any last comments before we call the question on this motion? Okay, seeing no hands, the motion is move that the council include an alternative and analysis of using no less than 129 metric tons for the river herring and shad cap throughout the rebuilding timeline. And so I'm going to go ahead and ask the council, as I have before, are there any objections to the motion from committee? Okay, seeing no objections, seeing no hands, are there any abstentions? Okay, seeing no abstentions, the motion passes by consent. I'm going to turn it back to Jason and see if there's anything else we need to take up before we conclude our session here this afternoon.
Thank you. And also to address Mary Beth's question, yeah, I'll double check that the standard river herring shad cap update has a good description of how the cap updates. I think it might be in there already, but if it's not, that makes sense for that to be included. Okay, so the one thing that I realized I hadn't kind of turned back to the committee on at the other meeting was that one thing that kind of affects some of the rebuilding projections is what's assumed for 2021 catch. Kind of my discussions with Garfo preliminarily indicated that that kind of is related to risk and within the council's purview to kind of direct those projections accordingly. The SSC so far has kind of used 23,184 for 2021 catch, kind of saying that, you know, that should result in not underestimating catch and therefore not setting us back at the initial start of rebuilding. So the council's emergency action recommendation was 15,512 metric tons, which input from the AP suggests is still likely a bit above what's actually likely to occur in this fall. Again, there's always a potential for substantial landings in the fall last few years because of some of the herring restrictions. It hasn't occurred. So I think my understanding talking to Garfo staff is the council could kind of specify that, you know, some other assumption is tolerable to the council from a risk perspective. You know, and I think given the trends in landings that we've seen, I think 15,512 is you know, there's always some risk depending on implementation of emergency rule or how the fishery goes that it could be higher. Don't think it's going to be that much higher. It's probably going to be a little bit less. So that's something, you know, and essentially, you know, that banks about, you know, 7,600 metric tons of mackerel that, you know, some of that disappears in natural mortality, but, you know, the projections will essentially bank some of that into biomass, roughly speaking. So that may be something the council wants to weigh in on. It affects the rebuilding projections. My sense given the trajectory of the current year. I think that 15,512 seems pretty reasonable and not super risky, but council can direct. Again, my understanding is from Garfo that the council could specify and direct that a lower amount than 23,184 is acceptable to it from a risk perspective. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jason. So this was not something that came before the committee. As far as there's no motion by the committee on this.
Yeah, we had a little bit of discussion, but it escaped motion making by the committee.
Okay, no problem. I might turn to the chair of the committee. Peter, do you have any thoughts on this?
I do, Mr. Chair, and I can make a motion now if you'd like.
Yeah, please do.
Let's let Jason get to his screen.
Yeah.
And Jason, while you're doing that, I sent you Espen's contact information. He was the contact over in Europe that was in charge of their pelagics. Okay. I move that the council select for 2021 catch projections utilizing 15,512 metric tons. And if we need to wordsmith that a little bit, we can certainly do that. Or if that gives you what you need, Jason, then we're fine with it.
Yeah, let me ask Jason, is that enough? How's the language on that, Jason? Are you clear with that? Or do you have any thoughts on how we can make that a little more clear? I mean, it's clear to me, but I just want to make sure you're okay.
Yep.
If I were going to recommend some wordsmithing, that is it.
That's perfect for me, but it is not a committee motion, so it will require a second.
Yeah, we're going to need a second on this one. Since it didn't come from the committee, I appreciate you bringing this issue up, Peter, and making that motion. Let me see if there's anyone else on the council that would like to second this motion before we have discussion. Dan Farnham, are you seconding the motion?
Yeah, that's right, Mr. Chairman, I will. Thank you.
Okay. Did you have anything that you wanted to offer before we go out to the rest of the council?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'll let Mr. Hughes cover that. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Peter, anything more you wanted to offer before I go out to the rest of the council?
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe this is built into our risk policy that we have the ability to do this. And if I'm wrong, then somebody correct me, please. Thank you.
I think it wasn't so much part of the risk policy, just more kind of within the purview of the council when addressing risk considerations and providing guidance to the SSC in terms of projecting out into the future. Thanks.
Well, there you go. Perfect rationale. You're a mind reader.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Thanks, Peter. Okay, let me see. Are there any other comments from members of the council at this time? Eric Reed. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a much more realistic number to use for 2021. The fishery that sometimes happens in southern New England, the end of November, beginning of December, is on a stock that's moving. They come around the corner and they're headed south, and they may show up for a little while, but they're not resident fish. They're gone. So I don't, with all the other management actions that are in place, with other fisheries, I think this is a very realistic number to use going forward. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that comment, Eric. Anyone else from council want to make any comment regarding the motion? Okay, seeing no additional hands, anyone from the from the public that would like to comment on the motion for the record? Okay, seeing none at this time, is there any objection to the motion by members of the council? Are there any abstentions? Seeing neither objection or abstention, this motion passes by consent. And thank you for that. Jason, is there anything else we need to take up before we take a quick break?
I think that about does it. I just, in previous similar framework situations, the council has kind of gone into it, providing staff some flexibility if some tweaks or an additional alternative that seems consistent with your intent today, and that can be provided some analysis going into kind of the next framework meeting. If the council is opposed to that, then it'd be good to let staff know that. Otherwise, if some little things pop up, may provide some suggestions and some analyses that bring to you at the next and or final consideration. And just if there are any, so if that's not the case, please direct staff accordingly. Otherwise, I'll assume that you're okay with that flexibility. And then if there's anything just else that the council want to address, otherwise that's it. Thank you.
Okay, Jason. Yeah, does anyone have anything they want to offer to staff? Regarding the question that Jason just answered? I think there's certainly room for flexibility in working through the options. And if there's anything else at this time, I'm going to look to see if anyone has anything they want to offer. And I don't see any hands at this time. So with that said, Jason, I appreciate all the hard work. It's certainly it's a ton of information that you went through today or this afternoon. And thanks for all your efforts. And we'll look forward to seeing things as they move forward. So, all right, seeing no other hands at this time. Again, Jason, thank you. I'm going to go ahead. We have the next item on our agenda is a joint meeting with the SSC. Dr. Rago, are you still on the line with us right now?
Yes, I am.
Are you okay if we take a quick break? I kind of need a break for a few minutes.
Absolutely not. I'm sorry. No.
Yeah. So no break. We're just going to keep.
No break. We're going straight in. No, that's fine.
Yeah.
Whatever you need.
Let's do this. Maybe we'll put a note on the screen. I could use 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay.
Just to take a quick break to go check on what's happening in my house. It's 3:30. That's what I have on my screen right now. So let's come back at 3:40, and we'll pick up with the joint meeting of the SSC. Give everybody a 10-minute break to go stretch their legs and get a snack or do whatever they need to do.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thanks.